Welcome to this screencast on developing with the Microsoft Graph. Let me first talk a little bit about what this screencast is and what you can expect from it before we start diving into the content. This screencast is going to accompany a hands-on lab and a training module that you can take advantage of that goes along with everything you're going to find in this screencast. Specifically, you're going to find in this screencast is really going to be an example of someone presenting the content from the training module as a way for you to learn how you could use this module and delivering it to a different user group or at a conference. However, you can also use it as self-paced learning. Now, the way that this module is set up is that it's broken up into a series of a couple different sections. We'll go through each one of them in just a few minutes. Each one of these sections is going to finish with a demonstration. Now, the demonstration, we don't walk through the entire step of creating the application or walking through the steps of writing all the code. Instead, we look at the final solution that has already been built and kind of pick through the code and pick through the important parts that you should take advantage of or you need to take note of. And we'll see it working as well. If you want to go through and you want to build the application, you want to see how it's being built, then what we would recommend that you do is go check out the hands-on lab that accompanies this module. Because the hands-on lab, each of the exercises maps to one of the demos inside of this screencast that you're going to see. So if you want to see how to build it and you want to walk through the steps, you can walk through the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module and get to the exact same place that we're showing you here in the screencast. Instead, we're not going to show in the screencast all the individual steps of creating the application. And part of that is because things change on a rapid cadence, and the lab is going to have the most updated steps and dependencies and stuff that you're going to need. The screencast is more or less showing you how the thing works or how the final solution works. So that's how you can learn more about taking advantage of this content and how we've structured this. Let's go ahead and dive into the actual module itself. In this module, we're going to look at leveraging the Microsoft Graph API from the SharePoint Framework. And in this first section, we're going to talk a little bit about working mostly as an overview of what the Microsoft Graph is, and then a little bit about how the integration works with the SharePoint Framework. Office 365 Developer Vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. And as a developer, you can bring your application into the user experience. With over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your application, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your application. There are currently over 850 million events created each month and a total of over 400 petabytes of data stored in the service that can add value for your users. The Microsoft Graph is the gateway to your data in the Microsoft Cloud. As you see there from the bottom of the list, we've got a lot of different services and data types that we can actually take advantage of from Office 365 and Microsoft. And it's all considered part of the Microsoft 365 platform. We can work with mail and calendar, contacts, tasks. We can work with content inside of SharePoint sites and lists, files inside of OneDrive, things inside of Microsoft Teams, users inside of Azure Active Directory. There's so many different things that we can take advantage of. The nice thing here is that each one of these different services usually has its own API where we can talk to these different services to get the data out. It can be challenging to go get the data from all these individual services as they each have their own endpoints, they may have their own permissions, and that also means that with their different access control that we have and talking to these different services using an OAuth-style authentication via Azure Active Directory, that means that each one of these different endpoints is going to have to require their own access token. One of the nice things about the service called the Microsoft Graph is that the Microsoft Graph is going to serve as a proxy endpoint to all of these other different services. It's going to encompass things such as Office 365, Windows 10, and Enterprise Mobility and Security. And it brings all of these different services under one top-level service called graph.microsoft.com. The advantage to using the Microsoft Graph is that it's going to allow you to just have a single point resource, which means you're only going to need a single access token to be able to talk to all these different services. They still have their own individual permissions, or as we refer to them as scopes, so that everything is still secured in a very individual way. But this makes it easier for developers to build applications. Now, the Microsoft Graph is your gateway to Office 365. And what I mean by that is that it is a single resource that proxies multiple Microsoft services. I'll talk more about this on the next slide. Now, it also allows for easy traversal of objects and relationships. So while there are lots of different Microsoft 365 services, such as talking to OneDrive or talking to Outlook for contacts and calendars, there's another one for tasks. One of the nice things about this is that how all of these different objects are related to each other, the Microsoft Graph has put those relationships into the graph, and it's built like a graph representation of all of these different endpoints. What's neat about that is that now I can easily traverse from one entity to another one, even if it crosses different endpoints, because the Microsoft Graph, they've merged all of these endpoints together for us. It also simplifies token acquisition, because with all these different services in Microsoft 365, we would have to obtain a separate access token for each one of them. The reason for that is because every single service when you talk to a different service that has a different endpoint, you need a separate access token for each one. Well, when the Microsoft Graph proxies all these together, we no longer need to do that because all of them have the exact same endpoint and they're all going to go to the graph. And then the graph is going to make those calls on our behalf to those other services or other endpoints that we would need to connect to. This also is going to eliminate, or the graph is also going to eliminate the need for a traditional discovery service, because like in the past, when we didn't have the graph, we had to make these calls to a discovery service to basically ask the different endpoints with Microsoft 365, where was my OneDrive endpoint or where was my Outlook endpoint, because the URLs could be different based on the user and the tenant. We no longer need to do that. Now the graph can figure out all of that information for us by if we just go to the /me endpoint or the /my organization endpoint to get information about me or my tenant. Now, one of the nice things about the Office 365 API or the Microsoft Graph API is that I mentioned that they were like a proxy to other endpoints that each one of the different services implements. Like we have different Office 365 services and APIs for Outlook or for OneDrive or OneNote or Planner, Microsoft Teams, etc. Well, the nice thing about the graph is that, again, it's a proxy to all those services. So you don't have to know how to talk to each one of those services or obtain an access token for each one. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that because it's a proxy, you may see new functionality and features show up in these downstream endpoints prior to when they get them and they show up inside of the Microsoft Graph. And that makes sense because the Microsoft Graph is a proxy and it can't expose functionality that doesn't exist downstream in one of the services that it's proxying. So you may have to wait a little bit for it to show up either in the beta endpoint or in the V1 endpoint of the Microsoft Graph. Some examples of this are webhooks when they were introduced to Outlook, and also when time zones were introduced when the time zone support was introduced for calendar items. Now, how do we access the Microsoft Graph? Well, you really have a couple different ways of doing it, really two different ways that you can do this. One way you can do it is through a REST API. And the nice thing about the REST API is anything and anyone can use the REST API. You can use any language on any platform and leverage any framework. And the reason for this is because effectively everything has the ability now to talk to an HTTP endpoint. And that's all the graph is just an HTTP endpoint. So what you have to do is you just implement the raw code to talk to the REST API, makes your life easy. Now, Microsoft has also created native SDKs that are going to leverage different frameworks and platforms to be able to talk to the Microsoft Graph. And some developers prefer this because what this does is it is also going to abstract away the details of constructing and processing the REST requests over HTTP. You got a lot of different options here. You've got options for .NET, iOS, Android, Java, PHP, Ruby, JavaScript, and that's just to name a couple. But keep in mind, each one of these SDKs is calling the Graph REST API under the covers. It's not all being done. It's not all being done by some special method. It's all ultimately calling the REST API. Some of these implement a Fluent API as well, if you so choose to, if you prefer that approach as well. But these two different options, there's nothing better or worse about either one of them. It really comes down to a developer preference. Now, let's talk a little bit about a dependency that the graph has, and that is on Azure AD. all Microsoft Graph access options are going to depend on Azure Active Directory. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to register an Azure AD application to access the Microsoft Graph. And then you're going to use that Azure AD application to authenticate and gain authorization by obtaining an access token. And then every single request you make to the Microsoft Graph is going to be done over HTTP. This includes the SDKs, and it's going to include an authorization header with the access token in it. Now, the SharePoint Framework is going to work a little bit differently than this, where we're not going to have to register an Azure AD application, and we'll talk more about that in this section as well as in the next section. We'll get to that though in just a minute. Now, Office 365 has a single authentication flow for Office 365 and the Microsoft Graph. Users are going to sign in using a technology called OpenID Connect, which is an open standard. And what that does is that once people have logged in, there's this nice little envelope wrapper that will include details about the individual who's just logged in. Azure AD is going to be used for all of the authentication. The Microsoft Graph is built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. Office 365 is also built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. So both of these services trust Azure AD. By having this single level of trust or single service that they both trust, then we can leverage the authentication to take advantage of both of these different services with the same authentication flow. This authentication flow is also going to support multi-factor authentication, also referred to as MFA, and federated user sign-ons. And it's going to support all different kinds of applications, from device applications such as those on a mobile device, websites, single-page applications that live 100% in the client, or as a headless application with no user involvement, also referred to as a daemon or as a service-based application. You'll be able to pin applications to your Office 365 app launcher from the My Apps page, which is like that little menu that you have in the top left corner within Office 365. Now, one of the concepts we have with Azure AD, and it comes into play with the Microsoft Graph, but it really is an Azure AD thing, and that's called the Common Consent Framework. So what happens is that if you think about permissions and being able to gain access to some service, you really have like a triangle of things that you need. We have the permission, we have the user or the application, and you have the resource that you're trying to talk to. So the resource is the Microsoft Graph, the user and the application, and then you also have the permission. So the user needs to have the permission to the resource to be able to talk to it. Well, the first time the user goes to log in to Azure AD to obtain an access token to talk to the graph, Azure AD is going to look and see, has this user granted this application access to the Microsoft Graph? And specifically, has it granted access to with these permissions? And so the way that this works is that if the user has not gone through this process yet, then the Common Consent Framework kind of kicks in. And after they log in, you'll see a dialog that looks a little bit like what you see there on the right of the slide. What this is saying is that effectively behind the scenes, it's saying you've never granted this permission to this endpoint with this application. So do you now grant that permission? And so what this is doing here, this is called the delegated consent. What this is doing is this is me granting a specific application. So in this case here, it says the publisher's website. What's the name of the app? I'm going to grant this permission to the Microsoft Graph. Or in this case specifically, is I'm just granting it to Azure AD. So reading directory data and signing me in and reading my profile. If I was talking to, say, my files or to my mail, it would have other permissions that were listed there as well. This is like an end user consent. I also have the ability to grant admin consent. And what that means is that is me as a tenant administrator granting these permissions by this application to a resource on behalf of everybody in my organization. That's a much more widespread permission that I'm granting. And it's not always required, but it is required at some point. So it's just an option that's available to you. Now, with the Graph, we do have two ways that we can authenticate, or with Azure AD, there's two ways we can authenticate, and the Graph supports both of them. Now, one way you can do is Azure AD only. And what this is that this says that you're only going to be using a work or school account. to authenticate to the Microsoft Graph or to Azure AD, and then use that to go talk to that access token to talk to the Microsoft Graph. The other option is you can use converged auth, which is Azure AD and or Microsoft accounts. And in this case here, what's nice about this is that depending on how I log in, I use the exact same code in the Microsoft Graph, the same endpoints, the same SDKs to get my files either in OneDrive Consumer or OneDrive for Business. And I just use OneDrive as an example. The same is true for calendar and contacts and email inside of Outlook.com or in Exchange in Office 365. But the nice thing about this is that the data that you're going to go fetch is all dependent based on the login of the user that actually logged in. So I don't have to specify any special code or any special APIs or endpoints to get data for consumer accounts or for business accounts. Now, again, with the SharePoint Framework, this doesn't really apply because we're only going to be logging into SharePoint Online using an Azure AD account and not a Microsoft account. Now, let's talk a little bit about Microsoft account and Azure AD accounts. This is something I just kind of mentioned a minute ago, where many apps will let you use either a Microsoft account and a Azure AD account, or I guess it's more of an or. The advantage here is that everything is the exact same. It's just a setting of what you support when you register the app inside of Azure AD. The Microsoft Graph has a single endpoint, single for all data, either business data or consumer data. Now let's transition a bit from the graph and let's talk about it in the context of the SharePoint framework. Now, earlier I mentioned that with the Microsoft Graph, you were going to have to authenticate against an app inside of Azure AD. Well, in the case of the SharePoint framework, just keep in mind the SharePoint framework is a client-side framework that only runs inside of SharePoint. Now, while it works on SharePoint Online, both SharePoint 2016 and SharePoint 2019, it doesn't really apply, or the on-prem story doesn't really apply in this case. And the reason for that is because the graph only runs in SharePoint Online, or only runs in Microsoft 365 and Office 365. And so we don't have to worry so much about, number one, the consumer accounts, and number two, we don't have to worry about creating an Azure AD account or having to deal with the login process, because before they can even call the graph, they're already logged in because they're inside of SharePoint Online where the SharePoint framework is. So they've already logged in, and we already know that what their account is with Office 365. Now, one of the challenges that we have, though, is that because it's all client-side, we don't have a way, just because of how the web technology works these days, we don't have a way to figure out that this request came from a SharePoint Framework component or that this request came from a specific application. We just know that it came from client-side inside of this domain or inside of this SharePoint Online tenant. And so the way that it works, the way Microsoft has implemented this, is that when in the SharePoint framework, you're going to make a request using the SharePoint Framework API to obtain an access token. And what that does is that sends a request back to SharePoint Online server side that's going to tell SharePoint Online, go authenticate and obtain an access token as SharePoint for this user with these permissions to the Microsoft Graph. So when I grant the permissions, I don't grant the application I'm granting them to is SharePoint Online. Now those permissions are unique to my tenant, but it's global to my entire tenant. So if I grant an application such as SharePoint Online, calendars.write, then anybody can write to a calendar using the Microsoft Graph if they do it through the SharePoint framework, or they do it through anything client-side inside of SharePoint Online if they know the call to make. And that's because we have no way to identify that this call came from this SharePoint framework component. Now, there is a little footnote here to mention, and I'm not going to go too deep off on this tangent, but there is a way that you can isolate the request to a specific Azure AD or a specific SharePoint Framework component or solution, and that's called isolated web parts. It's a function or capability that was introduced in 2019 in SharePoint Online for the SharePoint Framework. So I would just recommend you go look up the documentation in the SharePoint framework on isolated web parts if you want to learn more about that. So what does this mean then? Well, calls to the Microsoft Graph, if they're proxied through SharePoint Online, I don't need to create a separate Azure AD application. But it also means that I'm only going to be able to leverage business entities in my calls. I can't go deal with consumer stuff because I'm logged in as a SharePoint Online and an Azure Active Directory user. It also doesn't bypass any permissions or scope requirements. I'm still going to have to grant SharePoint Online specific scopes to the Microsoft Graph. So let's see a demo on how this works. Now, just like the other demos and a lot of our other Microsoft Graph modules, this is all going to be based off of a pre-built sample that I have that goes along with this module. So this screencast is associated with a training module. That training module has a hands-on lab associated with it. And one of the exercises in that lab walks you through the process from the very beginning of creating the application we're going to look at in this demo. So instead, what we're going to do here is we're just simply going to go through the demo to understand what's going on. And then we're going to see it actually run and how to grant the permissions to it. So let's go dive into that. Let's see a demo of how we can use the SharePoint framework to access the Microsoft Graph. Now, unlike other Microsoft Graph-based applications, I don't have to go ahead of time and create a Azure AD-based application to use for my application to log into to access the Microsoft Graph. And the reason for that is because SharePoint's going to actually be doing this stuff for me on my behalf. SharePoint's going to get the access token that it needs in order to talk to the Microsoft Graph. So what I have here is the standard SharePoint framework-based web part that I've created ahead of time. And I've gone ahead and added some code to it. I'm going to walk through the pieces that I've done in order to be able to use this. So the first thing I did is I want to show you the pieces that I've added here to make this work. Now, at the time of the recording, the Microsoft Graph support for the SharePoint framework is in a preview state. It's not currently in the generally available release. And so for that, I have to make sure that I'm using these special packages as part of the SharePoint framework to get support for beta and preview features. And the way I'm doing that is that when I run the Yeoman generator, like typing in yo at Microsoft/SharePoint, I'm adding in this plus beta on the very end. And what that's doing is that's just telling the SharePoint framework Yeoman generator that when it provisions the project to make sure that it that uses these preview packages to allow me to get access to these preview features. So that's one thing that I ended up doing ahead of time. Another thing that I ended up doing is I added in the Microsoft Graph types TypeScript package. And this is the different TypeScript type declarations that we're going to use in the Microsoft Graph client API that we're going to take advantage of inside the SharePoint framework. I don't have to go add in a reference to the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK because that's already included as part of the Microsoft Graph support with the SharePoint framework. Now, the next thing I did is I came over here and I looked at my web part. Now, my web part in this case is using the is a React-based application or React-based web part. So we're actually going to be using the Microsoft Graph in the web part itself. We're going to be using it in the React components. So I'll show you how I've done that. Here, all I did was I added in a reference to the Microsoft Graph client, or the MS Graph client. And that's coming from the SP client preview namespace here, or package. When this goes generally available at a future date, you're going to want to make sure that you use the correct packages, or it wouldn't be using the client preview. We'd probably be using something just called the SP client. Now, another thing that I did is if I scroll down a little bit farther here, you can see that my React application is called a graph persona. We're going to use the Fabric React control called the persona card, and I'm going to use that to display the user's information. Now, I'm also going in and I'm putting in the graph client as a public property here. And so what I've done is inside the public properties for my React-based component is I said that I want to use the graph client object, and that's the same one that we referenced up here above. So that's the public property on my React-based application. I then, and just getting a reference to the graph client by simply calling this one line, this.context.service-scope.consume, and then ms graph client.service key. And that's going to be able to give me an instance of the Microsoft Graph client. So let's take a look at this persona object here. So if I come over here and look at this persona object, this is the one where I've done all my work to be able to show the data. So the first thing I've done here is I've gone ahead and I've imported in the Microsoft Graph client, and I've imported in the TypeScript type declarations here. Now, I'm not ever really using this graph client in this case here. I'm always working with it straight off the properties that were passed in. Now, the way that this application is going to work is that when the React component loads or is mounted onto the screen, it's going to go to the Microsoft Graph and it's going to fetch the information about the current user. Once it gets that information, it's going to use that information to set the current state of the component. And the way React works is that when the state has been set or has been changed, React is going to trigger a re-rendering of the entire component. So what I have to do first is I have to define what the state is, what the state looks like to React for this component. It's got a couple different properties. It's got a name, email, phone, and image. Image is going to be an interesting one. We'll see how we're leveraging that in just a minute. So now that I've got this graph persona state that's been set, I now have my graph persona state that's been defined here on the React component as the second parameter. If I scroll down a little bit farther, you'll see that inside of my constructor, I'm then going to be initializing my state. So what I'm doing is I'm passing the properties in for the constructor, which is what's always going to happen with React component. I'm going to call the underlying constructor with those properties, but then on this one, I'm going to set the state to some initial values. And so here I'm setting the state to an empty name, an empty email, empty phone number, and a null image as well. Now let's look at the actual code to call the Microsoft Graph. So in this case here, I'm overriding the lifecycle event in React called the component did mount, which is the past tense of the application mounting. So here what I'm doing is I'm going to call the graph client that I've passed in earlier as one of my public properties, and I'm going to say underscore or .api/me, and that's going to go to the me endpoint for my component. I'm then going to call .get, which is going to go fetch information from the end user or for this current user, and then I'm going to call this set state on the React component. So that's going to set the state of the current user's name, email, and phone number. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting here is I don't have access to their image in this endpoint. I've got to go to a separate call to do that. So I went ahead and went to a separate call as well and grabbed that value. Now, both of these are asynchronous calls, so they're both going to happen asynchronously, but that doesn't really matter. The state can get set 2 different times. Of course, we could change the code here to change how the set is state or the state is set, so I don't set it twice, but it's not really that important for this demo. So here, to get the profile photo for an individual, I'm going to call API and then say me/photos/$value. Now, what that's going to give me is a base 64 string of the actual photo. And so what I have to do is I have to convert that base 64 response that I got back. I have to convert it back to some sort of a URL that I can use to put inside of an image tag. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the response type from it being application/JSON to being a blob, being like real binary data that's coming back to me, a base 64 image. And then what I'm doing when I actually make the get call, I'm going to use a method here on the window.url object in the DOM called create an object URL. And I'm going to pass back the raw response that I got back from the Microsoft Graph. And that's going to give me a URL to the actual image for the profile. Then, what happens when my application gets rendered? Well, this is the rendering. I've got a couple utility methods too, but this is just the bulk, where most of the work happens. When the state is set on a React component, it's going to call render. Render is going to return back a React element, and in this case here, a persona object or persona element. this persona component is going to have some text set, and it's also going to have for the primary text, and that'll be my name, and the secondary text will be my email address. The tertiary text will be my phone number. Now, when I get this text here, I want to change the way that the rendering is actually going to be displayed. So I have this method here, or this property called onRenderSecondaryText. So when it goes to render out this text, I can have it do something different. And I can do the same thing for the ternary text. Lastly, I can set the image URL and the size of the persona object. So these two things here for setting the ternary and the secondary text, these are just little utilities. And what I'm doing here is I'm just creating a special link using the link Fabric React component, or if nothing was passed in, I'm just going to return back this div. So our complete SharePoint Framework project has now been created and all set up. There's one last thing we have to do. We have to also specify what permissions our application needs. And for that, I'm going over to the package solution JSON file. Now for this, you see is I've added in one web permission here. I've got one web API permission for the Microsoft Graph, and I'm saying that this application needs user.readbasic.all. And that means I need to be able to see all the basic information about the current user. Now, if I don't do this, then when I add this application to my SharePoint project or my SharePoint tenant app catalog, it's not going to detect that this application has a permission request, nor is it going to give me the ability to approve that permission request. And so this application would fail when I was making a call to the Microsoft Graph right here and right here. So back here, the package solution, I've got it all specified. So now how do I go about setting this up? All right, so let's actually build this application and see it run. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to my command prompt and type in gulp build. And that's going to transpile all the TypeScript and SAS files down to JavaScript and CSS and get everything ready. I'm then going to say gulp bundle -- ship to create the JavaScript bundle that we're going to need for our application with all the JavaScript and TypeScript, and it's going to be packaged up or set up in a way in the bundle that's going to be ready for to be deployed. And then the last step is to say gulp package solution ship. And what that'll do is take all of the resources and things that were generated by the bundle process and generate a package file. And we can see that here if I go to the SharePoint folder in my project, I now see this MS Graph SPFX SP package, because that's the thing that I told it to be named, as you see right here. So let me go ahead and open that up or show you that inside of our project here. So here's our solution right there for our package. And let's go about and deploying this. So I'm going to come over here to my browser, and what I'd like to do is inside of this site, I'm going to want to add this application, be able to try it out. So let's go in and make sure that we have a page here. So I'm going to go to my pages library, and we have our MS Graph Tester page. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to come over here to my tenant app catalog inside of my SharePoint Online site. So I'm going to go to Apps for SharePoint, and I'm going to take that SharePoint package, and I'm going to drop it in. Now you'll see here that it's saying that it's going to be getting information from SharePoint Online, or specifically from a script file, which is going to be deployed to our Office 365 CDN. And then it's saying that I'm going to need to grant additional permissions. So I'm going to go ahead and click Deploy first. Let it deploy our application. Everything has been deployed, and we can see no errors, so we're in good shape. So now let's come over to the SharePoint Admin Center, and I'm going to refresh this API management page. And what you'll see now is there's that permission that's pending approval. So I'll select that and hit Approve. And now we can see that this one permission request has been approved. So now to test our application, I'm going to come over here to the site pages. Now before we can use this, we're going to need to install the application. So I'm going to then come over to our site here, and I'm going to say let's create a new app. And we will see our Microsoft Graph SharePoint Framework client-side solution. So we will let that go ahead and install. Now we can see that our application has been installed. So let's go back to our page for the MS Graph Tester. Let's put it into edit mode. And I'm going to go ahead and find my web part. So here's my graph persona. I will then select that. And you can see now that here is our application is now loading the data. Now, if I come over here and I look at the developer tools, and to save ourselves a little bit of time, I'm going to filter by graph.microsoft. That's enough, that'll find it. And let's refresh the page. And here we can see we've made a call for the Microsoft Graph. So we went to the /me endpoint and got a whole bunch of information here about the current user. And I can also see that I'm fetching a picture. That's not my picture, it's just a stock photo. But we can see here that we're making a request and we're seeing the data coming back. So we can see that there's the entire endpoint. We can see the raw response. It's a raw response, so we're not seeing the raw data. But if you put it in preview mode, we're getting the base 64 of the picture, and we can see it's listed here. So here in this demo, you've seen how to call the Microsoft Graph and add a permission to your SharePoint Framework project and use that data inside of a Fabric React control. In this section, we're going to talk a little bit more about how the SharePoint Framework accesses the Microsoft Graph. We talked a little bit about it in the last section. I'm going to go into a lot more depth in this section. So specifically, we're going to understand how the SharePoint Framework works and calls the Microsoft Graph. We're going to see how to grant SharePoint Online tenants scopes to access the Microsoft Graph, and then I have some resources for you. Now, we talked about this in the last section, but let me just recap this. When you come to SharePoint Online and you're going to run a SharePoint Framework solution, you're already authenticated. You're authenticated because you had to log in to Office 365, which means that you're logging into a work and school account using, under the covers, you're using Azure Active Directory. This means that SharePoint Online and Graph, because they both share the same dependency, you don't have to worry too much about the authentication story with your users when you're building a SharePoint Framework solution. This also means that the way it works is that all calls are effectively proxied through SharePoint Online. And what I mean by that is that you're obtaining an access token from SharePoint Online that's getting it from Azure AD for you, but your client-side solution is still making a direct call to the Microsoft Graph. It's not going through SharePoint Online, it's just getting the access token. SharePoint Online is getting the access token for you. This doesn't bypass any permissions or scope requirements. You still have to grant permissions to SharePoint Online to talk to the Microsoft Graph. But it does eliminate the fact that we can't use any consumer entities in our calls. Everything is all going to be based on business-based entities that we're going to talk to. Now, let's kind of take a step back here and let's understand a little bit about some of the challenges we run into with the SharePoint Framework. And I guess they're not really challenges, they're more or less just aspects of how client-side development works. When you call a secured service like the Microsoft Graph, it requires the acquisition of a token. You're going to authenticate and get authorized with Azure AD using an Azure AD application. And that's going to involve typically an interactive login and a programmatic acquisition of an access token. But when you have a client-side application, you can't securely do this across domains because you can't store an application secret client-side because it's not really a secret anymore. It can't be protected. You also would have to require some sort of authentication prompt with a pop-up or a redirection in order to secure this because you'd have to have some sort of a server-side component. So the way we're going to do this in SharePoint Online, the way Microsoft has done this, is they proxy all of this stuff through an existing Azure AD application. SharePoint Online already has an Azure AD application, so client solutions in SharePoint Online are going to call the SharePoint REST API in the same domain. So we don't have to worry too much about that authentication. That's all done with cookie-based authentication when we call the SharePoint REST API. There's no extra authentication that's required, and we don't have to give these tenants any extra stuff. Now, in order to call other services that are secured with Azure AD, we have to give the SharePoint Online tenant, the Azure AD application that runs the SharePoint Online, we have to get it granted specific permissions to call the Microsoft Graph. So you're going to provide that tenant with the necessary scopes, and then SharePoint is going to go authenticate with Azure AD to go obtain an access token that can be used to call the graph. SharePoint is not going to call the Microsoft Graph directly. It's just going to obtain an access token and hand that back to the calling application and let him call it for you. The responses from the graph are then returned back to the client-side application because the client-side app is calling the graph directly using the access token it got from SharePoint Online. Now, permission requests to the Azure AD applications, the resources, in our case, Microsoft Graph, they must be approved. And only the SharePoint Online tenant admins can grant or reject permission requests. All the approved permissions are available to all client-side solutions in a tenant. That last point is very important. All permissions are available to all client-side solutions in the tenant. So, how do we go grant scopes to Azure AD protected resources in SharePoint Online? The way you're going to do this is you have a couple different options. One way is to do it using a declarative approach. And so inside of the SharePoint Framework component, if you look inside the project in the package solution.json file, there's a new section for Web API permission request that you see there about the middle of the file. And you see you're specifying the name of the resource and the permission or the scope that you want to grant it. So the name of the resource in this case is Microsoft Graph, and we're saying that this application needs these three permissions. Users read basic all, calendars read, and tasks read. Now remember, it's not just this application that's going to get those permissions, it's the entire tenant. Now once I've gone through and I've packaged up my solution, I've deployed it to SharePoint Online, if I went with the declarative approach, there will be an extra note that shows up at the bottom of the dialog here when you go to deploy your SharePoint Framework package to the tenant scoped app catalog. You're going to get this extra little message that says that you need to go to this special page in order to grant the permissions that were requested. Otherwise, the application is going to fail. It's not going to work because the application has the permissions have to be granted. The grant of the permissions and the code itself are two completely independent things. They're not tied to each other. So once I go to the API management page in the SharePoint Online Admin Center, you're going to see that I'm going to have a list of permissions that are pending approval. In this case here, I've got one, user.readbasic.all. So I would select that, and in the right-hand side, a panel is going to pop up where I can click Approve to approve that specific request. So let's see how I can go about creating a SharePoint Framework component, specifically a web part, that is going to display calendar events from the Microsoft Graph in a SharePoint Framework client-side web part. In this second demo, we're going to see how to call the Microsoft Graph, but instead of getting data about the current user, we're going to see how to get data for the current user's events from their calendar. So the story for this one is basically the exact same as the last demo. In terms of the stuff that we did to get everything ready, was that we needed to make sure we used the plus beta flag when we created our project to make sure we got support for the Microsoft Graph, because as again, this is currently in preview in the SharePoint Framework. One of the library we are using in this one is called datefns. And these are just date functions that we can use to better format dates. It makes things a little bit easier to work with dates. So what I have here is another React-based web part, and this one's called the Graph Events List. Now you'll see this is set up basically the exact same way as the last one, where we are importing in the Microsoft Graph client as well as the type declarations. And in this case, we're not really using the type declarations. Now another thing that we're doing is we are just like before, we have updated the public properties for our React component to have a public property called Graph Client. So here, if I go and look at the properties, I have a Graph Client that we have listed here as well. In addition, we also defined a custom state. And our custom state for our component, when this changes, is going to have a list of events. And as you can see, we're using the Microsoft Graph TypeScript type declarations for an event object. So let's come back over here to our React component and let's see how this is set up. So here what we've done is I've imported in not just the state, and I've specified it as one of the parameters being passed into the React component. But I've also am using the list component this time from the Fabric React, as well as the format function from the date functions. Now, just like before, we're going to initialize the state to an empty array. So I'm now overriding the constructor and passing down to the object that I'm inherited from, or extending his component as well, or his constructor, and I'm setting the state equal to an empty state of events. Now, what happens when this application loads? Well, when a React component is added to the page, his onLoad or his onInit method, we call that stage or that phase of a component's lifecycle the mounting phase. So when the mounting phase is complete, it calls component did mount. Component did mount is going to run when my application is essentially initialized. So here's where I'm going to call the Microsoft Graph. I'm going to call the events endpoint, and here I'm going to get back a list of a bunch of events. Now, when I get this response back, it's giving it back to me as the array that comes back, or the response that comes back, has a value property on it, and that value property is an array of all of the different events. So here, I'm then going to just do a little bit of debugging and write that information out, but then I'm going to set the events collection equal to the events that came back from the Microsoft Graph. And I'm doing that by setting the property events on my state. When you change the state, that's triggering the render to happen. And then here is where I'm adding in a list of all my different items. And you can see I'm binding the items for the list equal to these events. Each time a new event is rendered or is bound, when it goes to render the cell out for the event, I'm going to define what that looks like. So I have my onEvent render cell. Each item that's being passed in is a Microsoft Graph event object. So I'm just going to have a div. I'm going to write out the subject of my event or my calendar item. And then I'm using the format function from the datefns library to render out how I want everything to be listed. So I've got the month, the day of the month, the year, and then it's happening at this time. So let's see how this works. The last thing that we had to do with this is that because we're going to the date endpoint, I had to add in a new permission here. Now, as you can see, I still have this same web part. I'm using the same project from the previous demo. So I still have my persona, and it still has the user read basic all permission, but I'm also adding in the calendars.read permission as well. So let's see this in action. I'm going to start by saying gulp build, which will transpile all the TypeScript and CSS and SAS files down to CSS and JavaScript. I'll then say gulp bundle ship, which will package everything up into a nice JavaScript bundle that I can use using Webpack. And then I'll just say gulp package solution. And what that will do is that will package up and update the SharePoint package for my application. So I'll now take my application. Let's go back over to the browser, and I now need to re-upload my application that we created. And that was coming from demo 2. So I will drop him in. And what you'll see is that when I drop this one in this time, I'm going to get the same prompt here to say you need to go update the permissions. So I'll say deploy. And now if I go back to the API management page in the SharePoint Online Admin Center and refresh the page, we'll now see a new pending approval here for calendars.read. Now, I don't need to worry about this first one because it's already been added, and this is just a little bit of the preview stuff happening with the UI right now in the preview portal. So that this would just be a duplicate. But I'm going to need to grant this permission. So I'll say Microsoft Graph and then calendars read. I will approve that permission. And so now we see calendars read is now showing up. If I refresh the page, kind of cleans up the UI a little bit. and unifies everything. Okay, so the Microsoft Graph has two scopes that have been applied to it. Let's see this run. Now, I'm going to show you a different way to run this. I could go through and do this the exact same way I did in the last demo, but because now my application has already authenticated with Azure AD, and my machine has already been cookied by the authentication code that's running client side, I now can leverage the SharePoint hosted workbench and run my application by testing it locally. So here what we'll do is I'll just paste in my hosted workbench, and it's going to tell me that it doesn't see the local site, the local server running. So let's switch back over and say gulp serve no browser. And what this is going to do is it's going to spin up a local server on my local machine, and it's going to serve up the manifest files and the JavaScript files from my application locally from my local workstation. So now if I refresh it, we won't see that dialog pop up, and we can also see that the manifest file is getting fetched by the local workbench, or by the hosted workbench. So now what I'll do is I'll click on this little plus ribbon to find my graph events list. And when I add this in, we now see a list of all of our calendar events coming back. And if I open up the developer tools and refresh, do a filter for graph.microsoft and refresh this page, we will see a list being fetched of all of our calendar events that you can see here. There's that value property I was talking about earlier, and an array of all of my items. So here you can see this calendar item. It has a subject of Cloud and Mobile Professionals, and here it is, the second one that came back as Cloud and Mobile Professionals, and we can see it was on June the 27th, 2018, or that's the last modified date. We can find the start date for this is going to be start date right here. There you go, April 12th, 2014. So April 12th, 2014. So you can see how we're using the date FNS library to render out the date in a friendly way. So this is just showing you how we can add additional permissions and scopes to an existing SharePoint Framework project, and in this case here, going to the events endpoint. In this last section, we're going to look at how the actual calls to the Microsoft Graph happen and how the integration works with the SharePoint Framework. We're going to look at it in a little more depth on how this works. Even though we've already seen a couple working examples, let's understand a bit about what's going on. So specifically, we're going to look at the JavaScript SDK for the Microsoft Graph, the type declarations for TypeScript, and the SharePoint Framework MS Graph client. So the Microsoft Graph has their own JavaScript SDK that they've implemented. It is available via, Microsoft Graph is available via the REST API and various SDKs, but they've also created a JavaScript SDK that we can take advantage of in client-side solutions. So you can see the link to it there on the slide. The one thing that's going to require is for you to initialize it with an OAuth access token in order to create a Graph client. So here's what the code looks like for this. Now this has nothing to do with SharePoint Framework. This is just the Graph JavaScript SDK. Here I'm going to Microsoft Graph.client.init, and I'm passing in an authentication provider. Now what I'm doing is I'm also going to have to include the access token to initialize the client. So that's going to create a new instance of the Graph client, but I've initialized it with this access token. And what that's going to do is that's going to then include the access token in the header of every HTTP request. And then I can use the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK's Fluent API to talk to the Graph by just going client.api/me and then doing a get, or I could add other parameters to it as well. There are also TypeScript type declarations that are made available with the JavaScript SDK. And so you can use these inside of your TypeScript-based applications, such as the SharePoint Framework project. These are going to introduce strong types and documentation to your client-side projects, making it easier to work with the JavaScript SDK. So how do you add those? Well, you're going to install the @Microsoft/Microsoft-Graph-Types type declaration, and then when you're going to import it into your project. And what you'll see here is right about the middle of the slide in the Get in the callback for the get method, notice that I'm casting the user object as a Microsoft Graph.user object. And what that means is that I can now use strong type properties that you see there for like user.displayname, user.businessphone. I can see all that information here straight inside the code for the objects that come back. So give me nice strong typing on the response objects. Now, that's all just standard Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK stuff. So let's look at how this works with the SharePoint Framework Graph Client. So the SharePoint Framework includes a Graph Client. It's called the MS Graph Client. Now, what's neat about this one is that this is basically the exact same thing we just saw a second ago, except for the fact that it can do all of the initialization for us. And the reason why it can do that is because we already have a way to obtain the access token. The SharePoint Framework has a way to call Azure AD server-side and fetch an access token and initialize a JavaScript library. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this.context.msgraphClientFactory, and I'm going to call getClient. And what this does is this is going to issue a call back to the SharePoint Online, and it's going to say, I need an access token for SharePoint Online to talk to the graph. SharePoint Online is going to go authenticate with Azure AD, obtain an access token that includes all of the scopes that have been granted, and it's going to fetch that access token back. It is then going to create an instance of the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK, and it's going to initialize it and then hand back a MS Graph client that is all initialized. And then from there, we can do the same thing with the code that you saw just a minute ago of using the Fluent API. We just don't have to go through the initialization process. Makes our life a lot easier. So let's see a demo on how I can check out the tasks inside of a user's planner using the Microsoft Graph in a SharePoint Framework client-side web part. In this last demo, we're going to see how to add yet a third component to an existing project that is going to fetch data from the a planner API to show a list of all the tasks that are currently assigned to me. Just like the previous ones, samples that we've shown, there's nothing special or anything extra to this example that we're going to show. This one is also going to be leveraging the preview packages for the SharePoint Framework, as well as our date utility library and the Microsoft Graph types. So these different packages that we've added using the npm command to install these different items. Now, if I come over here and look at the tasks, let's take a look at this one. So what is special about this? Well, this one is going to work pretty much the exact same way as the other ones. We've got our Microsoft Graph, that client that we've pulled in, and we're passing that in to our new component called Graph Tasks that has a public property called Graph Client. And so if I come over here and look at his public properties, we see we also have Graph Client listed here. Now, just like before, we're going to use the state to manage everything. And we're going to have a list of tasks as being what we're going to take advantage of inside of the state here. So we have a list of tasks, and these are planner tasks, or an array of planner tasks. So if I go back to my React component, what we'll see is we have our state that's being imported. We have passed it in as a second parameter when we declare our Graph Task React component. And we're doing our standard initialization stuff to set pass the properties into the constructor and set the state equal to an empty set of tasks. So here we're using, again, our date utility library and the list fabric React control. Now, what happens when we go to fetch stuff? Well, when the React component initializes, again, this is the mounting phase. And it's going to go to the me/planner/tasks endpoint. And that's going to go fetch all of my tasks that are assigned to me from the planner endpoint. When I get the response back, again, very similar to the response that we got back when we were working with events, it's going to have a value property. And that value property is where we're going to find all of those tasks. So then I'm just going to call this.setState on my React component to set that array. Now, the next thing is we want to look at is what happens in the rendering phase. And so here, just like our events, we are assigning the task collection on our state equal to the items collection. And then every time we get to a new planner task, we're just going to call render event cell. That's going to pass in a item, which is a planner task, and then we're just going to render it out like we've done in the previous demos. So let's see this one work. Now I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to do the gulp. Oh, the one last thing we need to see here is let's see the permissions. So the Microsoft, the Planner API, there is another permission scope called tasks.read, but that only applies to the Outlook task, not to Planner tasks. To get to Planner tasks, you're going to go to the group.read.all scope. So let's now come over here and let's do our same gulp build and then gulp bundle ship and gulp package solution ship. And so now it's catching up to me and it's going to go through and package it up. And now the next thing we need to do is we need to go upload our project again to the SharePoint app catalog so that I can get the extra permission scope requested. And in fact, why don't I show you what that looks like if we don't do that? So let's come over here to our application where it's going to be running, and let's actually fire this up. So we'll say gulp serve no browser. Now, as a reminder, if I come over here to the admin center and I do a refresh on this page, you'll notice that I only have two scopes, user read basic all and calendars read. I don't have group read all set, which is what I need to access Planner. So let's come back over here to our workbench and I'm going to open up the developer tools and let's do a quick filter for graph.microsoft and let's add in our web part. Now this is going to give us an error. The web part's not going to render anything, but you're going to see an error show up over here when we call the Microsoft Graph. So we'll add in tasks and we see we got a 403 and the response that we're getting here is a forbidden. And that's because we haven't granted this permission or this scope to our application, which is why we're getting a 403. If I come back over here to our application and we upload our application, our built application package, we'll upload it back to the library and hit deploy. There we go. And now let's go back over to the admin center and refresh this API endpoint and we will see our groups read all. So let's select that and hit approve. And we'll just refresh the page to validate it. And sure enough, we see groups read all is also getting added here as well. A little hard to see it, but it is right there. So, all right, so now that we have granted the permissions for this, let's take a look at what we have. So I'm going to close out the developer tools and let's go back over here to the Microsoft Graph Dev 03. And if I go to the training modules element here in the navigation, this is a planner plan. And here I've created 3 different tasks. So I have one that's been completed and then I have these other 2 tasks that have been defined. So what I would like to do is go back to my page here. I'll go back to my workbench. And if I refresh the page, I should see those tasks show up. And sure enough, there I do. So with this, you've now seen how we can go access yet a third endpoint with a third permission scope inside of our application so that we can leverage even more data inside of a SharePoint Framework-based application using the Microsoft Graph.
Now we've reached the end of this screencast for this module. You've seen a lot about how to do development with the Microsoft Graph based on the topic that we've covered here. Keep in mind that everything you saw here inside the screencast accompanies a training module where you can find slides and hands-on labs and all the final solutions that we showed you in the demos inside this screencast. So if you want to learn more, I recommend you check out the module associated with this screencast. Again, if you remember, the demonstrations that we showed you in this screencast, they don't walk you through every single step of building the application. Rather, we just look at the final solution that we've built and we see it running, which you can expect to see. If you want to see how to go about building a solution just like this, go look at the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module, because each of the demos corresponds with a specific exercise from the hands-on lab. So we have steps where you can walk through each one of these things. Again, one of the reasons we don't do all of the individual steps in the screencast is because things change on a very rapid cadence in this new cloud world, and different dependencies change, version numbers change, maybe a couple steps in screen caps are going to change as well in the hands-on lab. And so we keep the hands-on labs updated every couple months. But the videos would get out of date really quick if we tried to do that. So to save a little bit of time, we've just showed you the final solution, and we maintain the hands-on labs that you can take advantage of. I hope you got a lot out of this. There are a lot of other training modules associated with the Microsoft Graph that I'd recommend that you definitely take a look at. We've also got a couple additional links here that are at the end of the slides in the training module where you could use to learn more about this technology. So again, hope you got a lot out of this and you enjoyed this screencast. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch it.